always thought moving back to the ranch would mean peace. Fresh air, the smell of hay in the mornings, the gentle creak of the barn doors, maybe a little time to learn Grandpa's old tricks and stories. I imagined lazy afternoons sitting on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching the cows wander past the fence, and thinking, finally, I've escaped the chaos of city life. I was wrong. The first clue that something was off came one bright Saturday morning. I was leaning over the porch railing, wiping the sleep from my eyes, when I noticed unfamiliar white SUVs parked at the end of our long driveway. They had HOA painted on the side in big, bold letters. Normally, that would have been unremarkable. The HOA occasionally sent inspectors to check our lawn or make notes about the garden gnomes we had scattered around. But these vehicles didn't move like ordinary inspectors. They were parked too close to the gate, engines running. Something about the way the drivers sat in their seats, scanning the property with impatient glances, made my stomach twist. Before I could even process it, the first SUV lurched forward, hitting the wooden gate with a loud crunch. The fence shuddered like it had been punched in the stomach. I jumped back, nearly spilling my coffee. "What the hell is happening?" I muttered. Grandpa appeared behind me, his straw hat slightly askew. He squinted at the scene like he'd seen something similar 100 times before. "They're testing you," he said quietly, almost too calm. "Let's see if you're ready." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but there wasn't time. The second SUV roared forward and slammed into the fence again. I could hear the wood splintering under the impact. My heart was hammering. This wasn't a simple warning. This wasn't some petty letter shoved under the door like we'd seen before. This was full-on intimidation, and I had no idea why. I grabbed my phone, planning to record, but in my panic I tripped over a hose, landing face first in the mud. The coffee, of course, spilled everywhere. Grandpa just chuckled behind me, brushing mud off his hands. "You'll learn," he said with that half-smile that meant he was already 10 steps ahead in his mind. "This is nothing, just wait until they realize you're not scared." I looked at the fence, the wood groaning, splinters sticking out like jagged teeth. "Not scared," I shouted over the revving engines. "They're trying to smash us in." Grandpa stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Kid, the fence is just wood. You think wood can scare someone determined to cause trouble? You'll need more than that. That's why I've got a plan." I didn't want to ask what kind of plan. I just nodded, staring at the SUVs as the drivers got out. They weren't wearing the usual HOA uniforms. No badges, no formal ID, just black pants, sunglasses, and that unsettling confidence that comes from thinking they're untouchable. My stomach sank. These weren't ordinary people. These were imposters, and somehow they had chosen our ranch to start their games. Engines revved again. The gate shuddered violently, but it held. Grandpa just squinted through his binoculars, muttering, "They're back, and this time they mean business." I felt my knees weaken. What kind of person thinks it's acceptable to ram someone's fence at dawn? As the SUVs pulled away, only to return minutes later, I realized this was the start of something far bigger than a simple HOA dispute. This was going to be a fight for the ranch, our peace, and maybe even our sanity, and I had no idea if we were ready. All I knew for certain was that Grandpa wasn't worried, and somehow that made me feel just a little braver. After the first terrifying morning, I thought we could patch up the fence and life would go back to normal. I was naive, very naive. Grandpa and I spent the afternoon hammering in new boards, tightening the hinges, and muttering under our breath about what kind of people ram fences at sunrise. He worked silently, methodically, like a man who had already seen 1,000 situations like this, though I knew he hadn't. I was trying to keep my nerves in check, but every time the wind rattled the barn doors, I flinched. "I don't get it," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Why are they doing this? What did we do?" Grandpa chuckled, sliding a wooden brace into place. "Kid, they're not interested in what you did. They're interested in power. Some people just like to feel bigger by scaring someone smaller." He tapped the hammer against his palm for emphasis. "We're about to show them the opposite." I laughed nervously, though my stomach twisted. "We're about to show them the opposite with a wooden fence." He didn't respond, just smiled, that sly grin that meant he already had something up his sleeve. Night fell and the air grew tense. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed near the window, peering out into the darkness. Around midnight, a distant rumble made my heart skip a beat. Engines, headlights piercing the darkness. The SUVs were back. I grabbed my phone to record. Maybe we could have evidence this time. But in classic fashion, as I tried to line up the shot, my foot caught the edge of the rug. I tumbled forward and landed in a pile of blankets with a loud thump. I could feel my face burning from embarrassment, even though Grandpa just leaned against the doorway, shaking his head in amusement. "You're lucky they don't see you like that," he said, laughing. "They'd probably think you're a scarecrow." I groaned, trying to pull myself together, but then the noise outside reminded me why we were even here. The first SUV slammed into the fence again, and this time the wood groaned like it was about to collapse. The smell of burning rubber hit me from the tires skidding on the dirt, and I realized just how reckless they were. This wasn't a subtle intimidation. This was an all-out test of how much damage they could do. Grandpa didn't panic. He stepped closer to the window, squinting at the headlights. They think a little wood will stop us. They're wrong, but I'll admit it's going to take more than this to keep them away. The SUVs tried again, but the fence, patched hastily by Grandpa and me, held barely. I could hear the wood creak, splinters snapping like brittle teeth. My hands shook as I clutched the windowsill. "They're not stopping," I whispered. Grandpa didn't answer. He just nodded toward the barn. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start planning. They won't know what hit them." I wanted to argue, but something in his calmness settled me. He had a plan. I didn't know what it was yet, but I trusted him. And right then I realized that this wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing our ground, about protecting something that was ours, no matter how crazy the people outside our gate were. Hours passed. Engines revved one last time before the SUVs finally disappeared into the night, leaving a quiet that felt almost unnatural. I lay in bed, heart still racing, listening to the gentle creak of the fence in the wind. I knew tomorrow it would be worse or better depending on how you looked at it. And deep down, I also knew Grandpa was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The fence was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke to the smell of welding smoke and the metallic tang of steel in the air. I blinked at Grandpa, who was already in his coveralls, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, and a determined grin on his face. "I was hoping you'd sleep a little longer," he said without looking up, "but I suppose you're ready for the real lesson." "What lesson?" I asked, half terrified and half curious. "This," he said, gesturing to a stack of steel rails in the barn. "What didn't scare them, now we build something that will." I stared at the metal like it was a mythical beast. Steel rails for the fence? My mind started racing. "Are you serious, Grandpa? That's huge. Where are we even going to get the tools to do this?" Grandpa chuckled. "Kid, the world's full of hardware stores. A little charm, a little stubbornness, and some cash, and suddenly everything you need shows up at your doorstep." He tapped one of the rails with his hammer. "This isn't just a fence anymore, this is a statement." I followed him into the barn as he began measuring and marking the steel, his movements precise, almost artistic. Sparks flew from his grinder and I had to shield my eyes. "Don't blind me, Grandpa," I yelled, stumbling over a pile of scrap wood. "Good thing you didn't fall in front of the fence while it was getting rammed last night," he said dryly. "Would have ruined the surprise." I laughed nervously, but the tension was thick. The memory of engines revving, tires skidding, and the wood groaning under the fake HOA SUVs, assaults was fresh in my mind. This wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about pride, about showing that we wouldn't be bullied. Grandpa spent the whole day bending, welding, and fitting the steel rails into place. I tried to help, but mostly I ended up holding the flashlight or passing him tools, hoping I wasn't getting in the way. Each rail he installed made the fence look more like a fortress and less like the rustic barrier it had once been. At one point I asked, "Grandpa, what if they just bring bigger trucks? What if?" "They won't," he interrupted, hammering a brace into the corner. "Steel, angles, and a little brains, that's all you need. They'll try to push us, sure, but they'll think twice when their vehicles bounce off like toys." By sunset, the fence was transformed. The wooden boards were now supported by thick steel rails welded in precise angles, bolts glinting in the fading light. I stepped back, astonished. "It looks unstoppable." Grandpa grinned. "Unstoppable enough to teach a lesson. Don't get cocky, though. It's not over. They'll be back." I swallowed hard. Every nerve in my body was on edge, thinking about what might come next. Would they escalate to more SUVs? Would they try to sabotage something else? The suspense made the hairs on my neck stand on end, but there was something comforting in seeing Grandpa's confidence. That night we sat by the porch, surveying our handiwork. The stars were bright over the ranch, the wind rustling the grass, and for a moment it felt peaceful again. I wanted to believe that the steel fence would stop them, that this would be the end of it. Grandpa sipped his tea and looked at me with a twinkle in his eye. "Kid, I've seen a lot in my days. People try to bully, scare, and intimidate, but they forget one thing. Some people, some families don't back down. They adapt. They fight smart." I nodded, the suspense making me both anxious and strangely excited. Tomorrow would tell if Grandpa's plan worked. If the steel rails held, we might actually have a fighting chance. If not, well, I didn't even want to imagine it. As I finally crawled into bed, I could still hear the faint hum of the wind through the trees and the memory of those SUVs ramming our old fence. My mind raced with every possibility, but I fell asleep thinking one thing. With Grandpa on our side, there was no way we were going to let them intimidate us. And I had a feeling the fake HOA cops weren't ready for what was coming next. Night fell faster than I expected, and with it came the sound that made my stomach twist: engines. The headlights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees and reflecting in the windows of our house. My heart raced. The fake HOA SUVs were back. I crouched by the window, gripping the sill, trying not to make a sound. Grandpa appeared beside me, calm as ever, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coveralls. "Relax," he whispered, though his eyes were sharp, scanning the approaching vehicles. "They'll hit the fence and they'll see it doesn't budge, that's the lesson." I wanted to laugh, but the tension made me shake. "What if they don't stop?" I muttered. "What if they bring, I don't know, a bulldozer?" Grandpa smirked. "Then we call the ranch insurance, but trust me, kid, that won't be necessary." The first SUV lunged forward, tires screeching, and slammed into the steel-reinforced fence. Sparks flew as metal met metal, but the fence didn't move an inch. I gasped, expecting it to collapse under the impact, but the rails held fast. Grandpa, sitting in his rocking chair just a few feet away, took a sip of tea as though this were nothing more than watching cows graze in the pasture. "See," he said, calm as ever, "wood bends, steel does." The next SUV tried a different angle, slamming into the fence from the side. I could hear the crunching metal, the squeal of tires, and my palms were sweaty. I wanted to yell at them to stop, but I couldn't. My voice was stuck somewhere between fear and awe. Grandpa leaned over and whispered, "Watch carefully. They're aggressive but predictable. They don't know we've got a plan." I watched as the vehicle bounced off the steel rails, sputtering back a few feet, while Grandpa casually wiped his hands with a rag. He looked like a man watching a chess match he was about to win. "Not so intimidating now, are they?" he murmured with a grin. I couldn't help but laugh nervously. The headlights bounced like fireworks as the SUVs tried again, each impact sending vibrations through the ground. I realized then how serious this was. They weren't playing a game. They thought they could intimidate us, scare us into submission. But they had underestimated Grandpa, and that realization sent a thrill through me. Hours seemed to pass in seconds. Engines revved, tires spun, and the fence didn't budge. Grandpa even made small commentary between sips of tea, cracking jokes about how one of the drivers should have taken a welding class before trying this stunt. I couldn't help but laugh along, though my stomach still lurched every time a tire screeched near the gate. Then, just as suddenly as they arrived, the SUVs pulled back. Their engines faded into the distance, leaving a ringing silence over the ranch. I could feel my legs trembling, but I also felt exhilarated. We had survived the first real test. The steel rails weren't just decoration, they were proof that Grandpa's plan worked. I turned to him wide-eyed. "They're going to be back, aren't they?" Grandpa chuckled softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Oh, they will, but now they'll think twice. That fence isn't just steel, it's a warning. They hit it and it hits back. They don't know what's coming next." Even as I nodded, the suspense lingered. I knew this wasn't the end. The fake HOA cops were persistent, they were unpredictable. But for the first time, I felt a spark of confidence. We weren't defenseless. We had a plan, we had steel, and we had Grandpa. That night I slept a little easier, though the memory of engines and metal crunching against steel haunted the edges of my dreams. I kept seeing the SUVs, headlights cutting through the darkness, bouncing off the rails, failing to break through. And I realized something: this was no longer just about a fence. It was about pride, about protecting our home, and about showing that no fake cop, no bully could push us around. And deep down, I knew Grandpa was already plotting the next move. Whatever came next, we'd be ready. A week passed after the first showdown, and I thought we might get a little reprieve. I was wrong. That morning, as I stepped onto the porch, I froze. At the end of our long driveway, there were more SUVs than before. Engines idling, tires kicking up dust, the same black-clad figures behind the wheel. It was like they had recruited an army overnight. My heart pounded in my chest. "Grandpa, they brought reinforcements," I whispered. Grandpa, calm as ever, adjusted his hat and squinted at the approaching convoy. "Good, that means it's time for round 2. Let's see if they've learned anything from last night." I wanted to argue, to panic, but there was no time. Grandpa had already started moving toward the barn. "We need more support," he said. I followed, half excited, half terrified, as he pulled out even thicker steel rails, bolts, and more equipment. As he worked, I asked, "Grandpa, what if they bring a bigger vehicle this time? What if?" "Then we make sure the fence fights back harder," he interrupted, hammering a rail into place. "They think they're clever, but clever only goes so far against experience, kid." I couldn't help but laugh nervously. Grandpa had that uncanny ability to make the most terrifying situations feel manageable. Somehow I trusted him completely, even though I was still shaking inside. By sunset, the fence had transformed again. Angled steel rails now braced every vulnerable section, reinforced with bolts. Grandpa insisted on tightening himself. It looked less like a fence and more like a fortress. I couldn't imagine any SUV breaking through now without bouncing back or worse, embarrassing its driver. Night came and the tension was unbearable. Grandpa and I sat on the porch listening. Every rustle of the leaves sounded like approaching tires, every distant animal cry became a warning. Then headlights appeared, engines roared. The fake HOA SUVs were back, and this time they didn't come one at a time. They came in a line, engines growling as though daring us to try and stop them. The first vehicle slammed into the fence. Sparks flew, metal groaning under pressure, but the fence held. I could barely breathe, adrenaline coursing through me. Grandpa sipped his tea like nothing was happening, and I had to remind myself to look away from the chaos for a moment just to catch my own breath. The second SUV tried a side angle, bouncing off again. Tires screeched, and I swear I heard Grandpa mutter, "Not even close." I couldn't stop thinking about the audacity of these people, ramming our fence like it was some kind of amusement park ride. And yet, the sight of the steel rails holding firm made me feel a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Hours dragged on, each impact louder than the last. Sparks, smoke, and the smell of burnt rubber filled the air. I couldn't help but laugh nervously when one of the drivers spun his wheels trying to push through. Grandpa chuckled as well, pointing at the sliding tires. "Looks like someone didn't practice driving on dirt roads," he said, and I had to admit, it was almost funny in a twisted way. Finally, the vehicles began to retreat one by one. Engines faded into the distance, leaving a ringing silence over the ranch. I could feel my legs trembling, my heart still racing. Grandpa leaned back on the porch railing, smiling faintly. "See," he said, "they thought they could intimidate us. They tried to push, and nothing happened, not 1 inch." I nodded, still catching my breath. The suspense of the night had been unbearable, but now I felt a surge of confidence. We had survived the siege, we had stood our ground, and the fake HOA cops were beginning to realize they had underestimated us. Grandpa's gaze swept across the fence, inspecting each rail. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "They'll be back, but now they know, and knowing makes all the difference." I stared at the reinforced fence, illuminated by the moonlight, feeling a strange pride. This wasn't just wood or steel, it was our defiance, our protection, and a warning to anyone thinking they could push us around. That night I lay in bed listening to the quiet ranch, and for the first time in days I felt a tiny spark of peace. The battle wasn't over, but we were ready. Grandpa had turned our fence into a fortress, and with him by my side, I knew we could face whatever these imposters threw at us next. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be long before they came back, engines roaring, testing our steel and our courage once again. It was a restless night. I barely slept, listening to every creak of the barn, every whisper of wind through the trees, expecting the roar of engines to pierce the darkness at any moment. And just when I thought I could finally catch a few hours, headlights appeared at the far end of the driveway. My stomach sank. They were back, bigger, louder, more determined. Grandpa didn't flinch. He calmly stood on the porch, hands on his hips, surveying the approaching SUVs like a general preparing for battle. "They think they've figured us out," he said, voice low, "but they haven't seen the whole plan yet." I followed him to the fence, peering along the steel rails, every bolt gleaming under the moonlight. "The whole plan?" I whispered, nervously clutching the railing. "Grandpa, they've brought even more vehicles this time. What are we going to do?" He smiled faintly, almost mischievously. "Adapt, kid, that's what we do. We push smarter." And that's when it happened. The first SUV lunged at the fence, engines roaring like wild animals. Sparks flew as metal collided with metal. But this time, the steel rails weren't just braces, they were angled perfectly, reinforced with hidden supports that Grandpa had added while I slept. The vehicle bounced back several feet, unable to make a dent. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Grandpa, sipping his tea like nothing was happening, just nodded. "Predictable," he muttered. Then the coordinated attack began. 2 SUVs rammed from opposite sides simultaneously, trying to breach the fence in a synchronized push. My palms were sweating, my heart racing. I expected chaos, but the steel held firm. Grandpa had planned every angle, anticipating their moves like a chess master. "Look," he whispered, pointing to one of the SUVs that got its tires stuck in the dirt as it tried to push at an angle. "See what happens when you underestimate the terrain." I couldn't help but chuckle, despite the adrenaline surging through me. It was almost funny if you ignored the fact that these people were deliberately trying to destroy our property. One of the drivers slammed the steering wheel in frustration, and I swear I could hear Grandpa muttering, "Patience, kid. They're getting sloppy." Hours dragged on, each impact louder than the last. Tires squealed, metal groaned, and sparks flew like fireworks against the moonlit sky. I crouched low, gripping the railing as the SUVs tried every trick they could think of, revering, ramming at angles, even trying to push from the center. Nothing worked. At one point, Grandpa leaned over and whispered, "You see, they're panicking. Predictable aggression only goes so far when you're prepared. They'll make mistakes, and that's when you win." I watched in awe as one vehicle slid sideways, caught on the dirt, unable to maneuver properly. The driver cursed under his breath, glaring at the steel rails that had turned their intimidation tactic into a total failure. I realized then that Grandpa wasn't just defending the fence, he was teaching a lesson. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engines began to fade. One by one, the SUVs retreated, sputtering, groaning, and clearly frustrated. The fake HOA team had tried everything, but they were beaten. Not by force, but by brains, preparation, and a fence that refused to break. Grandpa took a final sip of his tea, surveying the battlefield like a proud general. "That's how it's done, kid. They came prepared to intimidate, but we came prepared to win. And winning doesn't always mean destroying them, it means showing them you can't be pushed around." I leaned against the steel rails, exhausted, exhilarated, and amazed all at once. The fence wasn't just standing, it was unshakable. And in that moment, I realized something bigger than metal and wood. This was about pride, resilience, and refusing to let fear dictate our lives. The suspense of what might come next still lingered in the air, but for the first time I felt confident. Grandpa had turned the tables. The fake HOA cops were learning a lesson they weren't going to forget anytime soon. And deep down, I knew that whatever they tried next, we would be ready. The sun had barely set when I saw them coming again. A line of SUVs stretched down our driveway like a mechanical army, their headlights cutting through the dim evening light. My stomach turned, my hands shook, but Grandpa was calm, almost unnervingly so. "They think they've won," he said, adjusting his hat. "They haven't even started." I followed him to the porch, staring at the vehicles as they revved their engines, ready for one final assault. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as the dust swirling around the tires. This was it, the moment that would decide if the steel rails and our family could stand against these fake HOA cops. The first SUV charged forward, tires squealing, engines roaring like wild beasts. Sparks flew as the steel rails held the impact, deflecting the vehicle with a force that sent it skidding back a few feet. Grandpa just sipped his tea and said, "Not even close." Then from the far side, another SUV tried to ram in a coordinated maneuver. I held my breath, certain that all of our hard work would finally give way. But the steel held firm, bolted perfectly at every critical point, angled to withstand even their most desperate attempts. The vehicles bounced back and the drivers cursed under their breath. "Kid," Grandpa said, eyes gleaming, "this is where patience wins. Watch them make mistakes, they always do." And they did. In their frustration, one driver slammed his SUV too hard, spinning his wheels and getting stuck in the dirt. Another tried to push from the middle, not realizing the reinforced braces absorbed all the force. Sparks flew, metal screeched, and I couldn't help but gasp in awe at Grandpa's preparation. Then it happened. One of the drivers stepped out with a megaphone, shouting threats and trying to intimidate us into submission. My heart pounded and I swallowed nervously. Grandpa leaned over the porch railing, squinting at the man like he was a bug he hadn't yet squashed. "You're done," Grandpa said casually, almost as if he were ordering a cup of tea. The megaphone fell silent. The imposters stared at him, unsure if he was serious, and he was. The tension was unbearable. Engines revved again and I braced myself for another collision. But the vehicles didn't move. The drivers exchanged nervous glances, realizing that brute force would get them nowhere. They had underestimated Grandpa, and the steel rails weren't just metal, they were a statement. "Kid," Grandpa whispered, "sometimes winning isn't about fighting harder, it's about making the other side realize they've lost already." I watched as one by one the SUVs began to retreat, engines fatting into the distance. The fake HOA cops had tried everything, coordinated pushes, desperate rams, threats through megaphones, and yet they had failed. They weren't defeated by violence, they were defeated by preparation, strategy, and a fence that refused to break. Finally, the driveway was silent, the only sounds the rustling trees and our own shallow breaths. Grandpa set down his tea, straightened his back, and gave me a small, proud nod. "That's how it's done," he said. They came to scare us, they came to test us, and we didn't just survive, we stood our ground. I sank into a chair, exhausted but exhilarated. The suspense that had kept me on edge for days finally began to fade, replaced by a thrill of victory I hadn't expected. The steel rails weren't just protection, they were proof. Proof that we could face intimidation and emerge stronger. Even as I leaned back, I knew the story wasn't over. There would always be people trying to push boundaries, trying to bully. But tonight we had won. Tonight the imposters learned that our ranch and our family wasn't going to be broken. And as the last SUV disappeared down the dirt road, Grandpa leaned over and whispered, just for me, "Never forget, kid, never underestimate a rancher with a plan." I smiled, heart still racing, realizing something important. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about courage, resilience, and showing the world that some things, family, home, and pride, couldn't be pushed aside. The morning after the final showdown felt almost surreal. The ranch was quiet, the air crisp, and the sun spilling golden light across the steel-reinforced fence that had become our shield, our fortress, and our symbol of resilience. I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to see the fake HOA SUVs lined up again, engines ready to roar. But there was nothing. Silence. Grandpa sipped his tea, leaning back in the rocking chair with a faint grin. "See," he said, "sometimes winning isn't about fighting. Sometimes it's about standing your ground and letting the other side realize they're the fools." I looked at the fence, the rails gleaming in the sunlight, bolts catching the morning glow like tiny stars. I couldn't help but laugh, a full, relieved laugh. We had survived chaos, fear, and utter madness. The imposters had tried to intimidate us, ram our fence, and scare us off. And yet here we were, standing proud, unbroken. Later that morning, real cops arrived, responding to neighbor complaints about suspicious vehicles and late-night disturbances. Grandpa greeted them like an old friend, calm and collected. The officers inspected the fence, the vehicles, and even took statements. They quickly realized that the so-called HOA officers were imposters, people pretending to have authority, harassing us for no reason. As I watched Grandpa explain the situation, I couldn't help but marvel at him. Calm under pressure, witty under fire, and clever enough to turn a simple fence into a fortress. He had not only protected our home but taught me a lesson I'd never forget. Preparation, patience, and brains often triumph over brute force. By afternoon, the tension that had been gripping me for days finally eased. The wind rustled the trees, birds sang, and I felt a deep, grounding sense of peace. The fence, still standing strong, wasn't just metal and wood, it was a symbol of what we had endured and overcome. I turned to Grandpa, smiling, "You think they'll come back?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Doubt it, they've learned their lesson, but even if they do, we're ready, we always will be." I sat on the porch, thinking back over the past week, the fear, the suspense, the late-night attacks, the sparks flying from metal and tires. I remembered the humor in Grandpa's commentary, the way he made me feel less panicked, even when everything seemed hopeless. And I realized that's what had made the difference. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. Neighbors came by later in the day, curious about the noise, the SUVs, the chaos. They stared at the fence in awe, whispering about the steel rails and the ingenuity behind it. Grandpa waved them off with his usual modest grin, but I could see the pride in his eyes. He had turned our ranch into a story people would talk about for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned back in the rocking chair next to Grandpa, sipping tea and letting the tension drain from my body. I felt a warmth that wasn't just from the setting sun, it was the feeling of triumph, laughter, and security. "Kid," Grandpa said softly, "always remember this. Some people try to scare you, some try to push you around. But if you stand your ground, if you plan, and if you keep your wits, nothing can break you. Not wood, not metal, not even the craziest fake HOA cops." I smiled, the lessons settling deep in my bones. The steel rails had held, the imposters had failed, and we had survived. More importantly, we had done it together. That night, as I finally drifted to sleep, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. The ranch was quiet, the fence strong, and I knew that no matter what challenges came next, Grandpa and I could face them together, unshakable and ready for anything. And for the first time in days, I slept without fear, dreaming instead of laughter, victory, and a fence that told the world one simple truth: this is our home, and no one is taking it from us. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.